Today we are going into the Beaver Wars. Beaver Wars was a thing that had to do with the Indians, and basically the Beaver Wars took place, and it was also known as the Iroquois Wars, or the French and Iroquois Wars. And it was a series of conflicts throughout that were fought intermittently during the 17th century in North America, throughout the St. Lawrence River Valley in Canada and the Great Lakes region, which pitted the Iroquois with the active support and arming by the Dutch and English against the northern Algonquins and their French allies. And as a result of this conflict, the Iroquois Indians destroyed several confederacies and tribes through their warfare. The Wendat or Hurons, Erie, Neutral, Monroe, Puttin, um, Susquehannock, Mohican, and the Northern Algonquins, whom they defeated and dispersed. And some fled to neighboring people, and others were assimilated and routed or killed. The extreme brutality and exterminatory nature of the mode of warfare practiced by the Iroquois has led some historians to label these wars as acts of genocide committed by the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, the Iroquois Indians sought to expand their territory to monopolize the fur trade with European markets. Let's see this here. Let me get something. Got my stuff here to eat. Hash browns. There we go. I got my coffee. Yep. It is snowing outside, so basically I'm keeping myself entertained for these videos. The Iroquois Indians sought, like I said, they sought to expand their territory to monopolize the fur trade with the European markets. Now, they originally were a confederacy for the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca tribes inhabiting the lands in what is now upstate New York, along the shores of Lake Ontario, east to Lake Champlain and Lake George on the Hudson River, and the lower estuary of the St. Lawrence River. Now, the Iroquois Confederation, led by the Mohawks, mobilized against the largely Algonquian-speaking tribes and Iroquoian-speaking Wendat or Huron, and the related tribes of the Great Lakes region. The Iroquois were supplied with arms by their Dutch and English trading partners, but the Algonquins and the Wendat were backed by the French and their chief trading partner. Now, the Iroquois Indians became dominant in the region, and they enlarged their territory as a result of the wars, realigning the American tribal geography. Now, the Iroquois Indians gained control of the New England frontier and Ohio River Valley lands as hunting ground from about 1670 onward. Both the Algonquin and Iroquois societies were greatly disrupted by these wars. The conflict subsided when the Iroquois Indians lost their Dutch allies in the colony of New Netherland, and the English took it over after 1664, along with Fort Amsterdam and the town of New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan. Now, the French then attempted to gain the Iroquois as an ally against the English, but the Iroquois Indians refused to break their alliance, and frequently they fought against the French in the 18th century. Now, the Anglo-Iroquois alliance would reach its zenith during the French and Indian War of 1754, which saw the French being largely expelled from North America. Now, the wars and subsequent commercial trapping of beavers were devastating to the local beaver population. Trapping continued to spread across North America, extirpating or severely reducing populations across the continent. Now, the natural ecosystems that came to rely on the beavers for dams, water, and other vital needs were also devastated, leading to ecological destruction. Now, the environmental change and droughts in certain areas, beaver populations in North America would take centuries to recover in some areas, while others would never recover at all. Ah, fucker. Now, French explorer Jacques Cartier in the 1540s made the first written records of the North American indigenous people in the region near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River estuary. Although French explorers and fishermen had traded there a decade before for valuable furs, today it's the Beaver Wars. It's an actual war that happened. Now, like I was saying, although the French explorers and fishermen had traded there a decade before for valuable fur, Cartier wrote of encounters with the St. Lawrence Iroquois Indians, also known as the Stata Conan or Laurentian people, who occupied several fortified villages, including Stata Cana and Hochelaga. He recorded an ongoing war between the Stata Conans and another tribe as the Tudoman. So wars and politics in Europe distracted French efforts at colonization in the St. Lawrence Valley until the beginning of the 17th century. Now, when the French explorer Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec in 1608, when the French returned to the area, they founded both sites abandoned by the Stadacona and the Hochelaga and was completely destroyed. And they found no inhabitants in this part of the upper river valley, although the Iroquois and the Wendat used it as a hunting ground. Now, the causes remain unclear, although some anthropologists and historians have suggested that the Mohawk Nation of the Iroquois Confederacy destroyed or drove out the St. Lawrence Iroquois Indians. Hold on here. Yeah, basically. Now, in 1603, Champlain had formed an alliance against the Iroquois Indians as he decided that the French would not trade firearms to them. Now, the northern indigenous provided the French with valuable beaver fur, and the Iroquois interfered with that trade. The first battle with the Iroquois Indians was in 1609, and it was fought at Champlain's initiative. Champlain wrote that had come with no other intention than to make war, but he and his Wendat and Algonquin allies fought a pitched battle against the Mohawks on the shores of Lake Champlain. Champlain single-handedly killed two chiefs with his arquebus, despite the war chief's arrow-proof body armor made of plated sticks. After which the Mohawks withdrew in disarray. And we got some interesting pictures on here too. Here. Okay, so we got those. Okay. Now, in 1610, Champlain and his French companions helped the Algonquins and the one that defeated a large Iroquois raiding party. Now, in 1615, he joined a Wendat raiding party and took part in the siege on an Iroquois town, probably among the Onondaga, south of Lake Ontario, New York. The attack would ultimately fail, and Champlain was injured. They probably did. I don't think I've ever seen it. There's a lot of different movies about different things. Between the years 1610 and 1614, the Dutch established a series of seasonal trading posts on the Hudson River and Delaware River, including one on Castle Island. And that was at the eastern edge of the Mohawk Territory near Albany, New York. This gave the Iroquois direct access to European markets via the Mohawks. Now, the Dutch trading efforts and eventual colonies in New Jersey and Delaware soon also established trade with the coastal Delaware tribe called the Lenape and the more southerly Susquehannock tribe. The Dutch founded Fort Nassau in 1614 and its 1624 replacement Fort Orange, both which are in Albany, which removed the Iroquois' need to rely on the French and their allied tribes or to travel through southern tribal territories to reach European traders. Now, The Dutch supplied the Mohawks and other Iroquois with guns. In addition, the new post offered valuable tools that the Iroquois could receive in exchange for animal pelts. They began large-scale hunting for furs. Um, they began large-scale hunting for furs to satisfy demand among their peoples for new products. At this particular time, At this time, conflict began to grow between the Iroquois Confederacy and the tribes supported by the French. Now, the Iroquois Indians inhabited the region of New York, south of Lake Ontario, and west of the Hudson River. The lands were surrounded on all sides, but the south by the Algonquin-speaking tribe, all traditional enemies, including the Shawnee to the west in Ohio country, the Neutral Nation, and the Wendat Confederacy, the confederacies on the western shore of Lake Ontario and southern shore of Lake Huron to the west, and the Susquehannock to the south. Now, these tribes were historically competitive with and sometimes enemies of the Iroquois, who had 5 nations in their confederacy. Now here you see firearms that were supplied from the Dutch traders followed allowed the Iroquois to wage effective campaigns against the Algonquin and the Wendat, and that was actually a thing that happened. Okay, so in the year 1628, the Mohawks defeated the Mohican Indians, pushing them east of the Hudson River and establishing a monopoly of trade with the Dutch with the Dutch with the Dutch traders at Fort Orange, New Netherland. The Susquehannocks were also well armed by Dutch traders, and they effectively reduced the strength of the Delawares and managed to win a protracted war with the Maryland colonists. By the 1630s, the Iroquois Indians had become fully armed with European weaponry throughout their trade with the Dutch traders. Now, the Iroquois Indians relied on the trade for firearms and other highly valued European goods for their livelihood and survival. They used their growing expertise with the arquebus. Let's see what this is, which is highlighted. Okay, that's what it is. It's like a okay. It's like a long ass gun. Let's see, if you can see this here, like this here. That's okay. It's like a long type of gun, like a rifle. Okay, that worked. Okay, that makes sense. I didn't even know that's what that was called. Okay, but at least we understand that now. Okay. So they used their expertise. They used their growing expertise with the arquebus gun to good effect in their continuing wars with the Algonquins and the Wendat and other traditional enemies. Now the French, meanwhile, outlawed the trading of firearms to their Indian allies, though they occasionally gave arquebuses as gifts to individuals who converted to Christianity. Now, the Iroquois Indians attacked their traditional enemies, the Algonquins, the Mohicans, the Innu, and Wendat, and the alliance of these tribes, with the French quickly brought the Iroquois into conflict directly with them. So the expansion of the fur trade with Europe brought a decline in the beaver population in the region, and the animal had largely disappeared from the Hudson Valley by 1640. American Heritage magazine notes that the growing scarcity of the beaver in the lands controlled by the Iroquois in the middle 17th century accelerated the wars. The center of the fur trade shifted north to the colder regions of southern Ontario, an area that was controlled by the Neutral and the Wendat tribes who were close trading partners with the French. with the decline of the Beaver population, the Iroquois Indians began to conquer their smaller neighbors. They attacked the Wenrow in 1638 and took all of their territory. Any survivors that did survive, they would flee to the Wendat for like refuge. Um, the Wenrow had served as a buffer between the Iroquois and the neutral tribe and their Erie allies near Lake Erie and the northeast. The neutral and Erie tribes were considerably larger and more powerful than the Iroquois Indians, so the Iroquois turned their attention to the north, and the Dutch encouraged them in the strategy. At that time, the Dutch were the Iroquois' primary European trading partners, with their goods passing through Dutch trading posts down the Hudson River. As the Iroquois Indians' sources of furs declined, however, so did the income of the trading posts. In 1641, the Mohawks traveled to a place in New France to propose peace to propose peace with the French and their allied tribes, and they asked the French to set up a trading post in Iroquois. Governor Montmagny rejected this proposal because it would imply abandoning their Wendat allies. In the early 1640s, the war began in earnest, with Iroquois Indians attacking on frontier Wendat villages along the St. Lawrence River in order to disrupt the trade with the French. In 1645, the French called the tribes together to negotiate a treaty to end the conflict, and Iroquois leaders Deganawida and Cossitans traveled to New France to take part in the negotiations. Now, the French agreed to most of the Iroquois demands, granting them trading rights in New France. The next summer, a fleet of 80 canoes traveled through Iroquois territory, carrying a large harvest of furs to be sold in New France. When they arrived, however, the French refused to purchase the furs and told the Iroquois to sell them to the Wendat, who would act as middlemen. The Iroquois were outraged, and they resumed the war. Now, the French decided to become directly involved in this particular conflict, and the Wendat and the Iroquois had an estimated 25,000 to 30,000 members each. The Wendat and the Susquehannocks formed an alliance to counter the Iroquois aggression in 1647, and their warriors greatly outnumbered those of the Iroquois. The Wendat tried to break the Iroquois confederacy by negotiating a separate peace with the Onondaga and the Cayuga tribes, but the other tribes intercepted their messengers and ended the negotiations. Now, during the summer of 1647, there were several small skirmishes between the tribes, but a more significant battle occurred in 1648 when the two Algonquin tribes passed a fur convoy through an Iroquois blockage. They succeeded and inflicted high casualties on the Iroquois, but in the early 1650s, the Iroquois began attacking the French themselves, although some of the Iroquois tribes had peaceful relations with them, notably the Nita and the Onondaga tribes, and they were under control of the Mohawks. However, who were the strongest tribe in the Confederation and had animosity towards the French presence. Now, after a failed peace treaty negotiated by Chief Canaquis, the Iroquois Indians moved north into New France along Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River, attacking and blockading Montreal. By 1650, they controlled the area from the Virginia colony in the south up to the St. Lawrence River. In the east, the Iroquois had driven the Algonquin-speaking Shawnee out of the Ohio country and seized control of the Illinois country as far west as the Mississippi River. In January of 1666, the French invaded the Iroquois and took Chief Canaquis prisoner. In September, they proceeded down the Richelieu, but were unable to find an Iroquois army, so they burned their crops and homes. Many Iroquois Indians died from starvation in the following winter, but during the following years, the Iroquois strengthened their confederacy to work more closely and create an effective central leadership, and the five tribes ceased fighting among themselves by the 1660s, but they also easily coordinated military and economic plans, and they increased their power as a result. No, I don't do Dungeons and Dragons. The Indian raids were not constant, but they terrified the inhabitants. Um, but they terrified the inhabitants of New France, and some of the heroes of the French Canadian folklore are individuals who stood up to such attacks. Dolan Armu, for example, died in May of 1660 while resisting an Iroquois raiding force at the Battle of Long Sault. The confluence of the St. Lawrence and the Ottawa rivers, but saved Montreal by his actions. In 1692, 14-year-old Marie Madeleine Jarrett successfully frustrated an Iroquois attack on some fort called Berkshires. In 1648, the French authorized selling guns directly to the Mohawks rather than through traders, and they promptly sold about 400 to the Iroquois. Now, the Confederacy sent 1,000 newly armed warriors through the woods to Wendat territory with the onset of winter, and they launched a devastating attack into the heart of the Wendat territory, destroying several key villages, killing many warriors, and taking thousands of people captive for later adoption into the tribe. Among among those killed were Jesuit missionaries, Jean Brebeuf, Charles Garnier, and Gabriel Lalement, each of whom is considered a martyr for the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the surviving one that fled and were dispersed from their territory, some taking refuge with the Jesuits of Quebec, some assimilated and adopted by the Iroquois, others joined the Puton or the Tobacco Nation, another Iroquoian people to become the Wyandot. The Ottawa tribe temporarily halted Iroquois expansion further northeast, but the Iroquois controlled a fur-rich region and had no more tribes blocking them from the French settlements in Canada. Now, diseases also had wiped out most of the Iroquois Indians too. Diseases had taken their toll on the Iroquois Indians and neighbors in the years preceding the war. However, and their populations had drastically declined. To replace lost warriors, they worked to integrate many of their captured enemies by adoption into their own tribes. They invited Jesuits into the territory to teach those who had converted to Christianity, and the Jesuits also reached out to the Iroquois, many of whom converted to Roman Catholicism and intermingled its teachings with their own traditional beliefs. Now, despite these battles looking like massive successes for the Iroquois, such victories brought issues to the nation. The Iroquois had taken more captives than they could assimilate, which led to divisions and factions within the nation. Many captives held on to their prior beliefs instead of assimilating as well. Large divisions went on to embrace a French alliance and migrated north towards Montreal to trade with the French. The Iroquois Indians accidentally aided the French throughout their destruction and captivity of the Wendat. Okay, so the Iroquois Indians attacked the Neutrals in 1650, and they completely drove the tribe from traditional territory by the end of 1651, killing or assimilating thousands. The Neutrals had inhabited territory ranging from the Niagara Falls Peninsula and westward to the Grand River Valley. In 1654, the Iroquois Indians attacked the Erie tribe, but with less success. This war would last for 2 years, and the Iroquois destroyed the Erie Confederacy by 1656, whose members refused to flee to the west. The Erie territory was located on the southeastern shores of Lake Erie and was estimated to have 12,000 members in 1650. Now, the Iroquois Indians were greatly outnumbered by the tribes that they subdued, but they achieved their victories throughout the use of firearms purchased from the Dutch. Now the Iroquois continued to grow, continued to control the countryside of New France, raiding to the edges of the walled settlements of Quebec and Montreal in 1660. An Iroquois force of 160 warriors attacked Montreal and captured 17 French colonists. The following year, 250 warriors attacked and took 10 captives. In 1661 and 1662, the Iroquois made several raids against the Abenakis, who were allied with the French. The French crown ordered a change to the governing of Canada. They put together a small military force made up of Frenchmen, one Dutch, and Algonquins to conquer the Iroquois raids. Now, but the Iroquois attacked them when they were ventured into the countryside. Only 29 of the French people survived and escaped, and 5 were captured and tortured to death by the Iroquois. Despite this victory, the Iroquois also suffered a significant number of casualties, and their leaders began to consider negotiating for peace with the French. Now, the tide of war began to turn in the mid-1660s with the arrival of the Carignan and the Saliers Regiment, a unit of roughly 1,000 regular troops from France and the first group of uniformed professional soldiers in Canada. A change in administration led to the government of New France to authorize direct sale of firearms and other military support for the Indian allies. In 1664, the Dutch allies of the Iroquois lost control of their colony of New Netherland to the English. In the immediate years after the Dutch defeat, European support waned for the Iroquois. The Onondaga, Seneca, and the Cayuga had reached a peace agreement with the French. However, the Mohawk and the Oneida people remained unwilling. Now, in January of 1666, Governor Daniel de Remy attempted to invade the Mohawk homeland. Now, the invasion force of 400 to 500 men briefly skirmished with the Mohawk, but failed to reach their villages as the French soldiers were ill-equipped to operate in the cold and deep snow. Now, the second invasion force was led by Alexandre de Prouville, whom Louis the 16th had appointed as Lieutenant General of the Americans. The invasion force of about 1,300 men set out in September 1666, and they reached the Mohawk villages in mid-October. The villages had been hastily abandoned, and now the Prouville had ordered the longhouses and fields of crops destroyed, and the expedition returned to New France. A peace settlement was reached with the Mohawk and Oneida in July of 1667. Now, once peace was achieved with the French, the Iroquois returned to their westward conquest in their continued attempt to take control of the land between the Algonquins and the French. Eastern tribes such as the Lakotas were pushed across the Mississippi onto the Great Plains. Now, in the early 18th century, when they adopted the horse culture and nomadic lifestyle for which they later became accustomed to, other refugees flooded the Great Lakes area, resulting in a conflict with existing tribes in the region. In the Ohio country, the Shawnee and the Miami tribes were dominant. Now, the Iroquois quickly overran Shawnee holdings in central Ohio, forcing them to flee into Miami territory. Now, the Miamis were a powerful tribe and brought together a confederacy of their neighboring allies, including the Potawatomi and the Illinois Confederation, who inhabited Michigan and Illinois. Now, the majority of the fighting was between the Anishinaabe Confederacy and the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Indians improved on their warfare as they continued to attack even farther from their homeland. Now, war parties often traveled by canoes at night, and they would sink their canoes and fill them with rocks to hold them on the river bottom. They would then move through the woods to a target and burst from the wood to cause the greatest panic. After the attack, they returned to their boats and left before any significant resistance could be put together. The lack of firearms caused the Algonquin tribes the greatest disadvantage. Despite their larger numbers, they were not centralized enough to mount a united defense and were unable to withstand the Iroquois Indians. Now, several tribes ultimately moved west beyond the Mississippi River, leaving much of the Ohio Valley, southern Michigan, and southern Ontario depopulated. Several Anishinaabe forces numbering in the thousands remained to the north of Lake Huron and Superior, and they were later decisive in rolling back the Iroquois advance. Now, from west of the Mississippi, displaced groups continued to arm war parties in an attempt to retake their land. Beginning in the 1670s, the French began to explore and settle the Ohio and Illinois country from the Illinois County from the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, and they established the post of Tassanog to trade with the western tribes. The Iroquois Indians destroyed it to retain control of the fur trade with the Europeans. The Iroquois also drove the Manahoac tribe out of the northern Virginia Piedmont region in 1670, and they claimed the land by right of conquest as a hunting ground. The English acknowledged this claim in 1674 and again in 1684, but they acquired the land from the Iroquois by a 1722 treaty. During a raid into the Illinois country in 1689, the Iroquois Indians captured numerous prisoners and destroyed a sizable Miami settlement. The Miami Indians asked for aid from others in the Anishinaabeg Confederacy, and a large force gathered to track down the Iroquois. Using their new firearms, the Confederacy laid an ambush near South Bend, Indiana, and they attacked and destroyed most of the Iroquois party. And a large part of the region was left depopulated. The Iroquois were unable to establish a permanent presence as their tribe was unable to colonize a large area, and the Iroquois brief brief control over the region was lost. Many of the former inhabitants of the territory began to return. With the tribes destroyed to the north and west, the Iroquois Indians turned their attention southward to the Susquehannock. The Susquehannock attained the peak of their influence in the 1650s, and they were able to use that to their advantage. Now, in the following decades, in the winter of 1652, the Susquehannock were attacked by the Mohawk. Although the attack was repulsed, it led to the Susquehannock negotiating articles of peace and friendship with Maryland. An Oneida raid on the Piscataway in 1660 led Maryland to expand its treaty with the Susquehannock into an alliance. The Maryland Assembly authorized armed resistance, and armed assistance, and described the Susquehannock as a bulwark and security in the northern parts of this province. 50 men were sent to help defend the Susquehannock village. Muskets, lead, and powder were acquired from both Maryland and the New Netherland, despite suffering a smallpox epidemic in 1661. The Susquehannock easily withstood a siege by 800 Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga in May of 1663, and they destroyed an Onondaga war party in 1666. A war between the Iroquois Indians and the Susquehannock Indians continued intermittently until 1674, when the Maryland colonists changed their Indian policy. They negotiated peace with the Iroquois and terminated their alliance with the Susquehannocks. Most historians believe that the Haudenosaunee inflicted a major defeat on the Susquehannock in 1674, since the Jesuit relations for 1675. Reports that the Seneca utterly defeated their ancient and redoubtable foes. In 1675, the Susquehannock moved into the south part of Maryland. Later that year, the militias of Virginia and Maryland besieged the Susquehannock fort and assassinated the Susquehannock chiefs during a parley. The survivors of the siege were eventually absorbed by the Iroquois Indians. English settlers began to move into the former Dutch territory of Upper New York State, and the colonists began to form close ties with the Iroquois as an alliance in the face of French colonial expansion. They began to supply the Iroquois with firearms as the Dutch had, but at the same time, New France's governor Louis de Bouillé had tried to revive the Western fur trade. His efforts completed with those of the Iroquois. It competed with those of the Iroquois to control the traffic, and they started attacking the French again. And this war would go on for 10 years. In 1681, Rene Robert Cavalier de La Salle negotiated a treaty with the Miami and Illinois tribes. France lifted the ban on the sale of firearms to the Indians, and the colonists quickly armed the Algonquin tribes, evening the odds between the Iroquois and their enemies. Now, with the renewal of hostilities, the militia of New France was strengthened after 1683 by a small force of regular French Navy troops and the Compagnie Francaise de la Marine, who constituted the longest serving unit of French regular troops in New France. In June of 1697, Governor Denonville and Pierre de Troyes set out with a well-organized force to Fort Frontenac. Denonville captured 58 male prisoners, and 36 of these were later shipped to Marseille, Marseille, France, to be galley slaves. 13 men eventually survived and eventually returned to Canada. He then traveled down the shore of Lake Ontario and built Fort Denonville at the site where the Niagara River meets Lake Ontario. The site was previously used by La Salle for Fort Conti from 1678 to 1679 and was later used for Fort Niagara, which still exists. Now, the Iroquois Indians retaliated by destroying farmsteads and slaughtering entire families. They burned Lachine to the ground on August 4th in 1689. Frontenac replaced Denonville as a governor for the next 9 years, which go from 1689 to 1698. During King William's War, which went on from 1688 to 1697, the French formed raiding parties with Indian allies to attack English settlements. As the English had allied themselves with the Iroquois against the French, perpetuating the Schenectady massacre in the colony of New York, the raid on Salmon Falls in New Hampshire, and the Battle of Fort Loyal and Portland, Maine. The French and their allies killed settlers in the raids and kidnapped some and took them back to Canada. The settlers in New England had raised money to redeem the captives, but some were adopted into the tribes, and the French government generally did not intervene when the Indians kept the captives. Throughout the 1690s, the French and their allies also continued to raid deep into Iroquois territory, destroying the Mohawk villages in 1692 and raiding Seneca, Oneida, and the Onondaga villages. The English and Iroquois had banded together for operations aimed against the French, but these were largely ineffective. Now, the most successful incursion resulted in the 1691 Battle of La Prairie. The French offensive was not halted by the 1697 Treaty of Ryswick that brought peace between the French and England, ending English participation in that conflict. The Iroquois Indians eventually began to see the emergent 13 colonies as a greater threat than the French in 1698. The colony of Pennsylvania was founded in 1681, and the continued growth there began to encroach on the southern border of the Iroquois. The French policy began to change towards the Iroquois after nearly 50 years of warfare, and they decided that befriending them would be the easiest way to ensure the monopoly on the northern fur trade. Now, the 13 colonies heard of the treaty and immediately set about to prevent it from being agreed upon. These conflicts will result in the loss of Albany's fur trade with the Iroquois, and without the protection, the northern flank of the 13 colonies would be open to a French attack. Nevertheless, the French and Indians signed the treaty anyway, and the French and 39 Indian chiefs signed the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, the Iroquois agreed to stop marauding and to allow refugees from the Great Lakes to return east. The Shawnee eventually regained control of the Ohio Country and the lower Allegheny River. The Miami tribe returned to take control of Indiana and the northeast Ohio. The Potawatomi went to Michigan, and the Illinois tribe to Illinois. This peace would last until the 1720s. In 1768, several of the 13 colonies purchased the Iroquois claim to the Ohio and Illinois country and created the Indian Land Company to hold the claim to all of the Northwest. It maintained a claim to the region using the Iroquois right of conquest until the company dissolved in 1798 by the United States Supreme Court. Now, many of the Iroquois people allied with the British during the American Revolutionary War. Particularly warriors from the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, and Seneca nations. These nations had long-standing trade relations with the British, and they hoped that they might stop American encroachments on their land. After the Americans emerged triumphant, the British Parliament agreed to cede control over much of its territory in North America to the newly formed United States and worked to resettle the American loyalists in Canada and to provide some compensation for lands the loyalists and Native Americans had lost to the United States. Mohawk chief Joseph Brant led a large group of Iroquois out of New York to what became the reserve of the Six Nations of the Grand River in Ontario. The new lands granted Six Nations Six Nations reserves were all near Canadian military outposts and placed along the border to prevent any American incursions. Now, the coalition of Native American tribes, known as the Western Confederacy, were forced to cede extensive territory, including much of the present-day Ohio. In the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, New France's involvement with the Iroquois and other native tribes in the Great Lakes region greatly impacted the future of French colonies. As well as the native tribes in the region, New France was less profitable and much more violent than Champlain and other French leaders had hoped. The French involvement in the native trade caused the French to entangle with complex native alliances. Which pitted tribes against the French, and French involvement also introduced disease, weapons, and war, which led to the further destruction of tribes in that region. Now, we reached the end of our video. If you like the video, you can get the video, like and subscribe to my channel, Rusty the King. You guys can leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Also, I do take recommendations. Let me know what videos you want me to do. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this, because I love doing my history videos. But I'll see you next week, and you guys can tune in to me talking about Guy Fawkes. Next week, my video will be on Guy Fawkes, who was assassinated in a plot to bring down. He was killed in something called the Gunpowder Plot, which was a massive failure. So tune in next week for me to talk about that and how his life ended. And I'll see you guys next week.